Start recording. Hello and welcome to episode 44 of the Abbasid History Podcast, a platform to examine pre-modern Islamicate history and a global medieval past, and the fourth filmed episode for our YouTube channel. We are sponsored by IHRC Bookshop. Listeners get a 15% discount on all purchases. Visit IHRC Bookshop at shop.ihrc.org and use discount code AHP15 at checkout. Terms and conditions apply. Contact IHRC Bookshop for details. I'm your host, Talha Hassan, a PhD student at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. Now onto the show. In 1319, Roger de Stangrave, a Hospitaller knight and a Jew named Isaac, arrived in England. For a ransom of 10,000 gold florins, Isaac had freed Stangrave, a stranger to him, from over 30 years of Mamluk captivity, and then accompanied the knight home to be repaid. By 1322, Isaac has converted to Christianity and became Edward of St. John, with King Edward II taking him as a godson. What motivated Isaac to ransom a stranger for such an exorbitant cost and leave his native Egypt and end up baptized in England, which at the time had expelled all Jews with the decree of Edward I in 1290, Edward I being the father of Edward II, until it was formally overturned under Oliver Cromwell in 1656. With the background of Crusades and European anti-Semitism, to share with us today his investigation of this curious tale is Dr. Rory McLellan. Dr. McLellan completed his PhD in medieval history in 2019 at St. Andrews, and is currently a cataloguer and manuscript researcher at the British Library. He specializes in medieval religious history, especially the Crusades and the military religious orders. His first book, Donations to the Knights Hospitaller in Britain and Ireland, 1291-1400, is published by Routledge. Welcome, Dr. McLellan.
Thanks for having me.
Before we begin telling the curious tale of Isaac and his ransom of Stangrave and his eventual baptism in England, we need some background context for three matters: on Jewry in England, the Crusades, and the reign of Edward II between 1284 to 1327. So let's look at Jews in England. The first records of Jews in England start with William the Conqueror, although one can speculate there may have been Jews prior during the Roman occupation. I think what many viewers may not know is that Jews were officially expelled from England by Edward I in 1290 until it was formally overturned under Oliver Cromwell in 1656. I'm just like, wow.
Yeah, it's not really an aspect of history that's always that well known unless you're either Jewish yourself or you're an academic who specializes in medieval England. When I first started working on this and sort of telling friends this is what I was working on, a lot of them expressed surprise that there were any Jewish people in medieval England at all. They assumed it was a later thing. But yes, there was a Jewish population in England some point after the Norman conquest. Don't know when exactly. And this is when they are first brought here by William the Conqueror in significant numbers. There might have been some Jewish people living here before, but in terms of when they appear in the record, it's from this point. And they have this really unusual legal status in that they're all considered the direct servants of the king. So he has this inclination to protect them because he can exploit them financially. He can tax them as much as he wants. He doesn't have to go through the nobility. Later on, he doesn't have to go through parliament. So they're quite useful economically to him. So he does have this odd relationship of protecting them, but it's still very exploitative as well. And eventually you end up having this system of arche set up across the country. So these were chests for storing the records of Jewish debts. It's one of a few occupations that they're allowed to hold is money lending. And this is actually quite valuable to the king, because when a Jewish person dies, the king gets a third of their estate. If they are executed as a criminal, or if they're banished, he gets all of their possessions. And sometimes if they can't afford one of the taxes, he will just take the debts instead. So he's got quite a strong inclination to actually establish this sort of system. And it's quite a useful way for us to work out how widespread the community was, because you only had these arca in towns where there was a significant Jewish population, which you can see from here. It's quite a lot of towns in England had a Jewry, and then there will have also been Jews living elsewhere in sort of smaller towns and villages. But it does show how widespread this population of probably several thousand people was across the country. And we know that they are in London from certainly by the late 1120s. So here we got the earliest evidence of Jewish people in London. It's from a cartulary of St. Paul's Cathedral, and in the second line on the left it says in Vico Iudeorum, so in the street of the Jews. So there's already a Jews street in London by this point. And the city is also home to the Domus Conversorum, because of course we're talking about a society that generally is still very anti-Semitic. They have official protection, but there's a lot of anti-Jewish feeling in the church, in the people that borrow from the Jews, and also you can find it in literature at the time as well. And so there is quite a lot of pressure for Jewish people to convert to Christianity. One of the problems they have, though, is that upon converting, you lose all of your possessions.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Because you're no longer now sort of directly under the king's control as you were before as a Jewish person. And so the king sees all of their possessions, which means that you then end up with a situation where, because they're Christian kings, they really are supposed to be pushing for the conversion of the Jews, but they're not actually incentivizing them in much of a way. And so Henry III, who rules from 1216 through to 1272, he is very interested in converting Jewish people. He actually takes part in this personally quite a few times. And sometimes he even ends up giving them his own name during the baptism. And he initially just sends them off then to monasteries for them to be looked after, because of course they don't have any possessions anymore. And they're probably ostracized by their former community, and their new Christian community might not fully trust them. So eventually he creates the Domus Conversorum. So this is a house in London. It's on the site of what used to be the Public Record Office in Chancery Lane. And this is for converted Jews can go and live there. They have a stipend, there's housing and so on. So you can see that this idea of conversion, I'm going to talk about later, is already quite an established thing by about the 1230s and 40s when the Domus is established. So it's not unusual. What's unusual about the story I'm going to talk about is just how late it happens.
Right.
For the rest of the 1200s, the Jewish community continues to be targeted by the crown and by others. There's increasing blood libels and anti-Jewish conspiracy theories, anti-Jewish attacks. The taxation by the crown gets heavier and heavier, but we can also see that the money they're getting each time is less. So the community is being drained financially, and it's not really recovering.
So you mentioned blood libel. What's blood libel?
So these are anti-Semitic myths about things like Jewish people kidnapping Christian children to sacrifice them for some sort of ritual purpose. And this really starts in England in the 1140s, when you have an accusation that some Jews in Norwich have murdered a Christian boy and crucified him. And then you have similar accusations over the centuries, and it spreads across Europe. And in England in the 1200s, you get another one of these major blood libels in the 1250s, but results in almost 100 Jewish people being executed. So you have these attacks coming from the church, from the crown, and sort of from the general population. In the 1270s, there's then a more directly sort of royal campaign against Jews, when Edward I has just been on crusade. Whilst he's on crusade, his father dies. He comes back to England as king, and he finds that the coins are not as valuable as they're supposed to be. So medieval coins, their value is based on how much precious metal is in it.
Right.
And they found that a lot of people have been doing what you can see with the two coins here, which is clipping them. So you cut off the edges of the coins.
Right.
So you can see that, for example, on the left, that the I just on the top right of the left-hand coin is not quite long enough, and the letters next to it are a little bit too short.
Right.
So people have been cutting the edges off these coins, which means the coin isn't actually worth as much, and so there's a worry that this can damage the economy.
Right.
So he launches investigations into this. And whilst initially they start looking at people working at the Royal Mint, who are all Christians, eventually it shifts onto the Jews, because they start to target any population that's seen as an outsider, but also deals a lot with money.
Right.
And this ends up with hundreds of Jewish people being imprisoned, at least 600 in the Tower of London alone. And the one figure we have, contemporary figure for how many are executed, is close to 300.
Wow.
So increasingly across this century, it just gets worse and worse. The community is getting smaller and it's getting poorer.
So, and to interrupt, Rory, do we have sense of numbers of the population?
By this point, it's probably only something like 2,000, maybe it's 3,000, and that's in a country of 2 to 3 million.
And so you're talking about by the late 1200s. Okay. Wow.
And so they're getting smaller, it's getting poorer. And so the sort of a financial inclination to have the population there as this group that the kings can tax quite easily and that they can use for other roles isn't really there as much anymore. And so in 1290, Edward I decides to expel the Jews and gives them a deadline to leave the country by 1st November.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So they either have to convert or leave, leaving, of course, most of their possessions behind. Of course, they can't take any of their landed property with them. And there's quite a mix of motives behind this. So, as I said, they're less economically valuable. The wealth has been drained. If the king expels them, then he does get an immediate cash gain. Because he can seize all of their property, he can also seize all their debts, and then he can still collect them, or can use that as a political leverage over people in his kingdom, by saying that he won't call on their debts if they do what he wants.
Right.
There's also pressure from Parliament to expel them. So the church is pushing for them to be expelled or converted. A lot of Parliament wants them expelled because they owe them money. And if they're expelled, they won't owe them money anymore because they won't be able to come back and collect it. And Edward had already expelled the Jews from Gascony, from English Gascony in right southwest of France in 1287, and that had brought in some money. So he had already sort of experimented with this idea beforehand. So the community all leaves or converts. Some of them will have gone into the Domus, some of them will have converted. everyone who works on this would love to be able to find evidence that there were some Jewish people living in England still practicing in secret,
Yeah.
but no one's really found that because, of course, if they were successful, they wouldn't leave any evidence. The majority of them, though, go abroad to France, and you can trace them for a little bit in the French community, but eventually they just sort of fade into that, and you lose track of the families.
Right.
So seemingly this is the end of Jewish people in medieval England actually practicing as Jews until the early modern period when Cromwell readmits them in 1656.
Yeah.
So that's to cover all the sort of the background of the Jewish part of this story.
Okay, so let's look at Edward II, 1284 to 1327, his reign, which coincides with the titular caliphates of Al-Hakim and Al-Mustakfi, 1262 to 1302 and 1302 to 1340 respectively, and the de facto rules of a number of Mamluk sultans, starting with Qalawun, 1279 to 1290, and ending with the second reign of Nasir ad-Din, 1299 to 1309. So looking at Edward's reign, how can we describe sort of the socio-political context domestically and abroad, and what was he like as a person as well?
He inherits quite a difficult situation from his father. So Edward I has led all of these campaigns in France and in Wales, and has got himself into an extended war in Scotland. But by the time Edward II succeeds in 1307, this war has been going on for about 10 years.
Right.
So he's come into it with conflicts on all these different sides. The conflict in France has quietened down for now, but it's still not entirely stable. And Wales seems to have been secured, but he does have this war in Scotland. Financially, it's not great either because of all these conflicts. So he hasn't really inherited the best position. He also hasn't had that much experience of direct rule himself. Edward I, when he is still a prince, he's given charge of a lot of land in Wales to administer and to sort of almost as a sort of a training exercise of him to learn how to govern. And he makes some mistakes early on, and he really messes some things up. But he does learn from this, and Edward II hasn't quite had the same chance. He's got quite a temper, which is common to quite a lot of kings in this family. He's very interested in religion. He sees himself as quite deeply religious. There's this story about him visiting Bury St Edmund's monastery with his father. His father then carries on, and Edward stays there for another 12 days. And one of the monks writes about how he seemed like he wished he could have just stayed here and lived with us, because he quite liked how it worked as a monk. He's also gullible. He seems quite easily manipulated, and that leads into one of the really big issues he has, is that he has favorites. He gets very attached to certain courtiers, often favoring them to the point that it then alienates everyone else. And these are often families that are seen as sort of upstarts and a bit sort of nouveau riche. And he's probably bisexual. There's a lot of stories at the time suggesting that he does have a sexual relationship with at least some of his favorites. And it is always difficult to tell, but it does seem quite plausible. And there's certainly some interesting imagery in that. At one point, when he's at the Tower of London, he doesn't stay in the King's apartments, or what were the King's apartments of Edward I. He instead stays in what was his mother's apartments, the Queen's apartments there. And he puts his favorite that he's rumored to be sleeping with in the King's apartments. So there does seem to be something of a symbolism that he's going for there. So having these favorites, the first one is Piers Gaveston, and then the second one is Hugh Despencer the Younger, and then also his father, Hugh Despencer the Elder. this antagonizes the nobility. They're not very impressed with him. It doesn't take very long for them to step in. So already, only a year after he comes to the throne, you do have some of the nobles talking about how they need to put some limits on the king's power.
Right.
And from 1310 to 1313, you have this group of barons called the Lords Ordainers, who try to set up a council that will put limits on the king's power, force him to rule in collaboration with the nobility. And one of the people enforcing this is Edward's own cousin, Thomas of Lancaster. So already quite early in his reign, he's having some of the serious problems that earlier English kings like John and Henry III had with their own nobility.
Mm.
So
yes,
things with...
we're going to talk about Isabella.
Yeah.
Because his wife, Isabella, well, Edward II ends up being cucked by this dude, Roger de Mortimer, and then they both declare war on her husband. What happened there?
So this is one of the reasons why the conflicts with France have sort of quietened down for a bit, is that Edward marries Isabella of France, and she's the daughter of the French king.
Right.
And she clearly dislikes Edward I's favourites. She really doesn't get on with them. Eventually, she seems to fear that Hugh Despenser is plotting to have her killed, and there's lots of complaints about her just not being well treated by her husband. In 1325, a conflict restarts in English-held France over whether the English should actually hold it or whether it should be directly under a French king. And so she, as a French princess, is sent to France to negotiate. But she doesn't come back. And she says that this is because she's worried that the Despensers are going to try and murder her and things.
Right.
And while she's there, she starts a relationship with Roger Mortimer, who's an English nobleman who's in exile in France, along with a few other people that have managed to anger Edward over the years.
Right.
And this eventually leads to her leading an invasion of England, because she's got her and Edward's son, Edward III, with her. So she and Roger Mortimer ally with some of the nobles in Flanders and then lead an invasion force. And they quite quickly manage to overthrow Edward II, install their son Edward as Edward III, and then have Edward II murdered in prison quite soon after.
Wow.
And this is an image of Mortimer and Isabella at the bottom, Isabella in the red, and then she's talking to Mortimer. And then at the top, in the background in the city, you can see a very large figure lying down being tortured.
Oh,
and
yeah.
that's Hugh Despenser the Younger being executed quite brutally. So that's sort of the end of Edward II's reign. Isabella and Mortimer end up sort of ruling with Edward as just a figurehead for about 3 years, until eventually Edward III seizes power in a palace coup and has Mortimer executed and sends Isabella away. And he then ends up becoming quite a successful medieval king and starts the 100 Years' War. So that's sort of the context of Edward II's reign. It's not very successful. And certainly by the time he gets to the late 1310s, things are starting to fall apart. He's only a few years away from civil war. He is starting to look very vulnerable, and he is quite desperate for any sort of ally or anything to make him look like a good and successful king.
Cool.
So now we should probably move on to the background of Crusades.
Right, cool.
So crusading movement begins really in 1095 when you have Pope Urban calling the First Crusade. It's this mass expedition from Europe, heading out to firstly to Byzantine Empire, and then eventually it carries on and they manage to conquer Jerusalem. And they quickly then establish the Crusader states. So you have the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, County of Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And this is a very quick, large land grab, but it never really expands further than this, not by a significant amount anyway. And so over the next 200 years, the Crusaders are slowly pushed back more and more. Occasionally they rally if there's a big expedition coming from Europe again, but again, it just starts to decline. And Edward I, when he's still a prince, goes on crusade in one of the later expeditions to the east. And he goes in 1270, he's initially heading for Tunis, because whilst the Crusades initially start with this expedition to the Middle East, the movement quickly spreads everywhere. You start having crusading in Spain, in the Baltic, even against other Christians and against heretics within Europe. And in North Africa, it really diffuses everywhere. And this particular expedition had been led by the French king Louis IX, and he goes to Tunis, and it doesn't go very well. He catches dysentery whilst doing a siege, and he dies. Edward arrives to find that the French king has died. His heir is also very ill, and everything's sort of fallen apart. So he then carries on further and goes to what's left of the Crusader states in the Holy Land. And he goes to Acre. And then he helps defend the city. He manages to consolidate things a little bit there.
Right.
But there's not really any great success. At this point, the Crusader states are really hugging the coastline. They've been pushed back so much. And there's not a great deal that Edward can do. And he then eventually comes back home. Now, among Edward's forces was a detachment of Hospitallers. So these were one of the main military religious orders. After the First Crusade, all of these Crusades, you've established this massive territory, and then most of the Crusaders go home again. And that's actually what happens after most of the major Crusade expeditions, is that they got there, they fought a few battles, and now they've gone home.
Right.
And so there's this massive manpower shortage. They're now surrounded by people that they've either gone to war with or threatened to go to war with. So obviously they're not very well liked, and they need as many sort of soldiers as they can get. So you start having this idea arise of combining the lifestyle of a monk with that of a knight, because then they're going to be permanently in the East. They won't be a crusader who has to come and go, doesn't want to be in the Holy Land for too long because he doesn't know what's happening to his family or his property back in Europe. Instead, you can have a permanent force of warrior monks that will always be there.
Right.
And the first of these are the Knights Templar, the most famous. The second major order are the Knights Hospitaller, and they're initially this little hospital in Jerusalem that then takes on a military role.
Right.
And these are amongst Edward's forces. And one of the knights that came with Edward is Roger de Stangrave,
Right.
who's one of the two sort of central figures to this story.
Right.
So he is a Hospitaller knight. He's from a Yorkshire family that doesn't seem to be that important, sort of minor gentry and knights, not really that noteworthy. He doesn't seem to have any important rank within the order either. And he's in Acre with Edward I in 1271. Seems to be in the king's in the retinue of the king's uncle, and he then joins the Hospitallers. And he's captured at the Second Battle of Homs in 1281. This is a battle between the Ilkhanate and the Mamluks, And some of the Crusaders, including the Hospitallers, support the Ilkhanate in this battle, and they get crushed.
Right, the Ilkhanate being the Mongol state.
Mm. And at this point, he's probably a young man, because when he writes about his story, he says that he's spared from being executed because of his youth.
Right.
So he's probably in his teens or in his early 20s. He is then imprisoned in Alexandria in Cairo for 34 years.
Humongous number, 34.
And he claims that several of those are, well, the way he describes it, it sounds like solitary imprisonment for quite a few of those years. So it is a massive chunk of his life. By the time he is released, he has spent more of his life in prison than he probably spent freed.
Right.
The second major figure is Isaac.
Right.
We don't have a surname. We don't have much more detail about his names, unfortunately. So we can't know for certain where he's from. We know that he is a Jewish man who's working as a ransom broker for a Genoese merchant called Segurano Salveggio. Even though at this time, of course, you as a Christian, you're not really supposed to be trading with non-Christians. And the papacy repeatedly puts out bans from people doing this. A lot of people do it anyway.
Right.
And this guy is one of the quite important merchants working with the Mamluks at this time. So we don't know for certain where Isaac is from. Maybe he was an Italian Jew, maybe he was an Egyptian, or maybe he was from Palestine or Syria.
Right.
But he is working in Egypt at this time. And he ends up freeing Stangrave in Cairo. And then they both leave Egypt from Alexandria. And he claims to pay this massive fee of 10,000 gold florins, which for someone like Stangrave is really unusual, because as a comparison, about 30 years later, in 100 Years' War, Edward III ransoms a French count, and he charges 80,000 florins. And that's for a count, that's for a very senior noble, while Stangrave, he isn't from an important family, he's not important within the Hospitallers.
Right.
So it's a bit odd, the idea that he's worth an eighth of a count.
Right.
But this is the story that they go with. So he ransoms him, and he asks whether he can leave Segurano Salveggio's service and go with Stangrave back to his people. And he's given permission, so he leaves. And first they go to Rhodes. So by this point, the Crusaders have been completely kicked out of the mainland of Syria and Palestine.
Right.
Their last major stronghold of Acre fell in 1291. The Hospitallers have now retreated into the Mediterranean, and they've set up Rhodes as their own independent state.
Right.
From which they're conducting sort of naval warfare against the Mamluks and against the Ottomans. And Stangrave and Isaac come to Rhodes, and they spend 2 years there. And then they move on, which does seem a bit unusual. It suggests that perhaps they weren't repaid. Maybe Isaac was there with the hopes that Stangrave's order would then repay him these 10,000 gold florins. But clearly that doesn't happen. They carry on instead to England. And this is really unusual that you have him arriving in England at this time because of the expulsion. They ask for permission before they actually reach the country, and they're given it towards the end of 1318. So even though he normally wouldn't be allowed into the country as a Jew, he's under royal safe conduct, so he is allowed in this time. And in January 1319, they both arrive in England, and they make their way up to York, where Edward II is holding a parliament. This is an image of one of his father's parliaments. And they meet with the king there, and they tell Stangrave's story. And they say that he had been in prison for all of these years, and that Isaac had paid this 10,000 gold florin ransom to free him, and he had come with him all the way back to England so that Stangrave's relatives in Yorkshire could repay the ransom, with the implication that Isaac will then just leave. And Edward is immediately drawn in by this story. He sends off letters to the Grand Master of the Hospitallers saying, can you please give a nice sort of a cushy job for Stangrave, sort of a nice house somewhere in England that he can manage and that he can retire in. And he asks the Pope to offer indulgences to anyone that donates to Isaac to help repay the ransom. So he's clearly really taken in by this, and he repeats the 10,000 gold florin figure. And Isaac has a safe conduct for a year. 1 year later, in 1320, he's given another year's safe conduct. And then he disappears from record. And people know that later on, Stangrave ends up writing a sort of, they're called recovery treatises. So this is basically a how-to guide for reconquering Jerusalem.
Interesting.
And Stangrave writes it, and it has his whole story in it, and then also all this advice. And so we know that he's still alive in 1331 when he presents this to Edward III, but other than that, he then just disappears. And that's it. No more mention of Isaac. So I knew about this part of the story before I had come across it. It's been in some of the secondary literature. Sometimes if you read a book about Jews in medieval England, it's there in the conclusion as a sort of, oh, this is an interesting story that there was a practicing Jew under royal protection for 2 years in England, but then he must have gone home. And that's the end of it until Cromwell. But what I found was that actually Isaac doesn't leave. Instead, he converts to Christianity. And of course, upon conversion, he takes a new name. And so that's why he has disappeared from a record, looking for the wrong name. So in 1322, there's another royal safe conduct issued for a man called Edward of St. John. And the safe conduct says that this is someone who was baptized, and the king himself helped in the procedure, in the ceremony, and the king is his godfather. And I then looked further into this Edward of St. John, and I found that there's a document quite later on in 1346 where the head of the Hospitallers in England is writing to the king, now Edward III, saying, in the past, your father asked us to give a pension to a Edward of St. John in return for some services that he did. Could you please not ask this again, because it is very expensive? And they say that the reason they gave it to him was because he rescued Roger de Stangrave from the prison of the Sultan of Babylon, which is just a phrase that in medieval European sources you find used for, well, it could mean the Mamluks, it could mean someone in Damascus, it could mean someone in Baghdad. It's really quite vague. But the fact that you've got this person who clearly is a convert to Christianity, and is explicitly credited with rescuing Roger de Stangrave, suggests that they are the same person.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because there's only Isaac mentioned in the story up until now. There's no mention of another Jewish person who might convert. And there's other evidence if we go back to the Domus Conversorum. So this is a house for converted Jews and their families. Looking into Edward of St. John, we find that his children are given stipends at the Domus Conversorum. So he clearly is a Jewish convert. Another very fortunate finding, well, survival, is that, as I mentioned, Roger Stangrave writes this how-to guide for retaking Jerusalem. And unfortunately, it only survives in one manuscript. And that's one of the many cotton manuscripts that gets badly burnt in a fire in 1731. So it's for the manuscript, it's basically just the central sort of portion of each leaf survives, and all of the edges have been burnt off. But thankfully, the really key important bit does still survive. And that is when he is retelling his story, there is a section where he says, where he recounts his meeting with someone he just calls the Jew.
Right.
And it is the Jew talking to Segurano Salvejo, and he's saying to his employer, "Can you please free this person? Can I then go with him and leave?" And his boss says, "Why do you want to do this? You know, he's a Christian. When you get to Christian lands, they won't even set eyes on you." And this Jewish man says, "Oh, that's fine. I wouldn't wish for any other grace." And says that he wants to be able to convert. So there clearly is this implication that this Isaac did want to convert. We then have Isaac disappearing, and we have this new person who helped Stangrave and is clearly a Jewish convert. So he must be the same person.
Yeah.
And it's just this fascinating example that you do for 2 years have a Jewish person living freely as a practicing Jew under royal safe conduct in England. There's a tiny case of another Jewish person being invited back to England in very late in the reign of Edward I, but it seems on quite a temporary visit just to sort out some business dealings. And there's another case when they're interested in getting a Jewish doctor to come. Neither of these are long-term, neither of these are 2-year visits, it seems. So this does seem a quite unique example. And Isaac, after his conversion, he settles down, he has a family, he has at least 2 sons and a daughter, and he gets married to a woman called Joanna Edwards, which suggests that she might be a convert as well, because that's such a significant name in that she's named after, presumably after St. John, who is the patron saint of the Hospitallers that have looked after her husband, and then also after Edward, as in Edward II, the king that baptized her husband.
Right.
So she might very well be a Jewish convert as well, though we don't know where from. And Isaac/Edward lives out the rest of his life until he dies sometime between April and May 1348. And he seems to be quite well off. His will survives, and he seems to have a few shops that he has in London. He's been renting a countryside estate from Hertfordshire from the Hospitallers, and he's got a nice pension when he turns up to visit the Hospitallers. He gets some money each year, he can eat there, he can stay and sleep there as well. And after that, though I haven't been able to trace his wife or his children any further, at least one of his sons seems to predecease him because he's not in the will. And Stangrave probably has died by this point as well.
Yeah.
Because by the time that he is freed in 1316 and 1315, he's probably in his mid-50s. So by this point, he would be in his mid-80s.
Yeah.
It's possible for someone to live that long in this period. There are examples. But after 34 years of imprisonment, he probably didn't have very good health.
Right. Wow.
So one of the bits that is unusual for this, though, is why does Edward II take this interest in the story?
Right.
Because we do know that he doesn't really care much about the convert community in England. So you still have the Domus Conversorum, and they are still funded by the crown. But the money that they're getting hasn't been increased for years. And so they start sending in petitions to the king saying the money just doesn't go as far anymore. And we have some people living here who've had to turn to begging or who've died because they just can't afford to live. And Edward doesn't really do anything about it. And he doesn't seem to take any interest in going out and actually participating in conversions like his grandfather Henry III did. He employs a few converts as sort of bodyguards and administrators and diplomats, but still not to the same extent that Henry III or Edward I did. So why does he suddenly get really fascinated by Isaac and Stangrave, and to the point that he sends off petitions to the Pope and to the Hospitallers, and he keeps on giving safe conducts, and that he eventually participates in this baptism? And I think it really comes down to the context of his reign at the time, that things aren't going very well for Edward II. He has already had one of his favourites forcibly removed and executed. He had this thing with the Lords Ordainers trying to restrict his power. He is quite badly losing the war in Scotland. You've already had the great Scottish victory of Bannockburn, which has seen his army crushed. So things aren't going so well. There'd been a diplomatic visit abroad recently where he was rather humiliated on his trip to France. And he's then presented with this story where it sort of ties into everything that a medieval king should care about.
Right.
So medieval Christian king should be interested in spreading the faith, so in converting. And they're all expected to have some interest in the Crusades and ideally go on crusade. And Edward II has taken the cross. He has made a crusade vow in 1313. He never goes, but he has made that vow. And not only that, it's a story that is linked to his father, because Stangrave had been on crusade with Edward I. And you've got this crusade veteran coming back from the east who fought alongside or saw or met or served with this much more popular king that everyone else thinks much better of than the current one. And it's this chance to welcome this savior of a crusade veteran into the faith. So it really ties into all of these things that as a medieval Christian king, Edward II should be interested in. And we also know from some of the religious stories that he gets interested in, that this is the sort of thing that Edward can be fascinated by. At one point, he's approached by a priest who says that he's got a relic, which is from when Thomas Becket, so this very famous Archbishop of Canterbury, who has a massive falling out with his king, Henry II, and eventually is murdered. During one of these fallings out, he ends up being exiled to France. And supposedly whilst he's in France, the Virgin Mary visits him and gives him some holy oil. And this priest says to Edward II that he's got this holy oil. And if you have yourself anointed again, in the same way when you have a coronation ceremony and they put the holy oil on your forehead, if they do this to you again, all of the troubles of your reign will be over, everything will start going great, you'll be able to go and reconquer the Holy Land and it will be brilliant.
Right.
And Edward is clearly taken in by this, because he actually writes to the Pope and says, well, should I do this? Would it be okay for me to be reanointed again? Like, is that theologically, is that all right? And the Pope sort of says, well, you could do it, but you shouldn't be really reanointed twice, because that's a bit strange. You've already been anointed by God once. So if you were to do it, you have to do it privately. You can't really tell anyone, which defeats the purpose. And that really the best way for your reign to go better is to live a virtuous Christian life and so on. And Edward is really upset at this. He actually has the priest imprisoned for a while for embarrassing him. And he eventually writes to the Pope and says, oh yeah, I was taken in, and he uses the phrase that it was his dove-like simplicity.
Right.
So by his own admission, Edward can be taken in by sort of dramatic, romantic, fascinating stories like this.
Yeah.
I think that's what really draws him to Isaac and Stangrave's story. But the other uncertain bit of it is how there's this ransom figure of the 10,000 gold florins, and was that really true? And what was in it for Isaac in helping Stangrave? Because I can't find any implication, any evidence that Isaac and Stangrave knew each other before his imprisonment or during his imprisonment. His description of his time in prison is quite rough. It doesn't sound like he had many visitors. So why does Isaac spend all of this money to free someone that he's presumably never met, from a different religion, probably a different culture as well, and then travel with him over a period of 3 or 4 years, first to Rhodes and then all the way to England, traveling thousands of miles and presumably spending quite a lot of money to do all this traveling?
Yeah.
So why exactly does he do it? And I think that the 10,000 gold florin figure is either an exaggeration or it wasn't just for Stangrave. So in Stangrave's account, he does say that actually he was part of a bigger ransom exchange,
Right.
that he was he was exchanged along with a few Christians with a lot of Mamluk prisoners on Cyprus.
Right.
And so maybe the 10,000 isn't for one night, it's for several people, which makes it a bit more plausible. But then you still have the idea of why does Isaac travel all this way? And I think it's because the idea of being in England, well, being first on Rhodes as the savior of this night is actually a way for him to have a better life. I don't think it's to do with conversion, because if he wanted to convert to Christianity, he could have joined the Copts in Egypt. If he really wanted to be a Catholic Christian, he could have converted when he was in Rhodes, and he was there for 2 years and he didn't. And even when he gets to England, he doesn't convert for at least a year. So I don't think conversion is the reason behind it. I think it's because if he's going to be in England as the savior of this hospitaller, he's probably going to have a better status than he'd have in Egypt. So there aren't any pogroms directly around the time when he ends up leaving Egypt, as far as I can tell. There's one a few years before, about a decade before, when the Mamluks put in some new restrictions on things like how dhimmi can't have houses taller than Muslims and things. They can't work for the Sultan or the Emir directly and so on.
Yeah,
and they have to wear...
Dhimmi's been the state that Jews and Christians had under Muslim rule, whereby they had certain liabilities and certain things they couldn't do. We had a podcast on that earlier that people can listen to. Sorry, to carry
on. And also they had to wear clothing that identified their religion. So they had to wear a particular coloured turban depending on whether they were Christian, Jewish or Samaritan. I think for Jews it's yellow, I think it was. And so it's not really a great place to be living if you've got a way out. And there is an account from a Franciscan friar who visits about 7 or 8 years after Isaac and Stangrave leave. And he visits Alexandria and Cairo, and he says that the Muslims there regularly call Jewish people dogs. So there clearly is a hostile, anti-Jewish elements in society and from the legal system at the time. And he's then presented with this opportunity to free this man who is this long-lost war veteran and who was on crusade with the current King of England's father. So if he then goes all the way back to England with him, he will be welcomed as this savior of this war hero. So you can think about other sort of more recent examples that, for instance, after the Vietnam War, you have all of these stories about, there are still American POWs out in Vietnam. And can you imagine what sort of reception would happen if someone turns up then in 1990 and they've got one of them with them?
Yeah.
What sort of rewards are they going to get? The medals, all of the publicity, the career that they could make out of it. They wouldn't really struggle, I think, to have a good lifestyle after having that sort of connection with saving this figure. Because by this point, the Crusader states have been gone for 25 years, or for more than 25 years. So it really is something that people will have either been to quite a while ago or will have only ever heard stories about. So you can see how it would be something that would just enthuse people, and they would be willing to then donate to repay this ransom. They would be taken in by this story. They would find it fascinating. They would want to support it. And from what we can tell, they did. He ends up clearly having a good amount of wealth by the time he dies, going by his will. He has property, he has houses, and he manages to raise a family. I think the conversion then is because he knows that, yes, he has the current king's favor. That king's not going to be around forever. And that king might even change his mind. And for all he knows, he won't get the safe conduct renewed next time. And then he'll be back where he started. He might have some wealth he can take with him, but he'll probably have to leave quite a lot of it behind. He won't have the status that he will have acquired in England.
Yeah.
So I think conversion is something that is just necessary for him to do. It's the way that he can ensure that he can stay on and he can still have this life that he's built for himself in this country, which is still very hostile to Jewish people at this time.
It's a fascinating tale. I think one question I have is how did Isaac get to know about the existence of Stangrave in the first place?
Well, he is working as a ransom broker, so he's gonna be presumably going into prisons.
Oh, he was a ransom broker.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, okay. So yeah, he would have known about different. Very likely known about all different prisoners and things.
Yeah. So he would have been going in, and there would have been prisoners who would, he'd be able to say to them, "Are you from an important family? Are they going to pay for you to get back if I free you?" That sort of thing.
Right, right.
So I think that's how he will encounter him, and I can only assume that at this point, Stangrave's been in prison for 34 years, more than half of his lifespan at this point. He may have just seen this as his last chance. He does say in his manuscript that shortly before he's freed, one of his captors says to another one that they shouldn't ever free Stangrave, because if they do, he'll go back to the Hospitallers and he'll convince them to attack Alexandria. So they should just kill him instead.
Right.
So he may have just, whether that particular bit of the story is true or not, he probably just realized that this time was running out, and perhaps making this deal saying, look, we say that it's this massive amount, that whatever figure you pay, that's actually just for me, not for all of us. And people will repay you. And that's how he then persuades Isaac to free him, and perhaps he even points out that Isaac would be able to have a better life in England because he'd be the savior of a Crusade hero rather than of a Crusade veteran, rather than a Jewish person in a country where he is going to be second class as a citizen.
I mean, it could be he found the message of Catholicism compelling once he was in England as well. Yes,
but it's just odd then that he could have done that in Rhodes, and they were there for 2 years, because the Hospitallers are Latin Christians, they are Catholics. So it is strange that he's there for 2 years and doesn't convert at that point. And that even when he's in England, it does take another year. It is possible that yes, he ends up having some sort of religious event where he does realize it suddenly towards the end of his time, towards the end of his safe conduct in England, that actually this is a religion he wants to be part of. And maybe Isaac's defense of him, suggesting that he always wanted to convert, is genuine. Certainly there probably would have been people that would suspect his conversion a bit. We have examples from when there were Jewish people in England, in medieval England, regularly.
Mm.
From before the expulsion, we do have examples of some Christians treating converted Jews as not being real Christians, as being somehow suspect.
Mm.
So it's possible that he was still treated as suspect, and that's why Stangrave felt he had to write down this story, going, no, he always wanted to convert.
Before we wrap up, you also have this interest in the sort of contemporary far right and their usage of Crusade iconography. Why don't you tell us about some of your work on that, or some of your thoughts on that?
Yes, this is quite a growing sort of area of research, and also the source base is constantly growing as well. So you've had people looking at like the later memories of Crusades and the later legacies of the Crusades for quite a few years now, but most of that has focused more on the Victorian period, and when you get all the literary works and all the paintings and things about the Crusades. And I started looking more into the Templars and the Crusades. So we've had a few people have looked at how the Crusades have become particularly persons again ever since you have George Bush use the word crusade soon after 9/11, and you then have Islamist use of the Crusades as well. But no one has really looked at the Templars and the other military orders specifically in great detail, and not from the perspective of being a historian of the military orders. So I started looking into that and have done a couple of articles on that so far. And there is just so much material for it. It's something that the far right in several countries is really enthused by. They really seem to favor this imagery of Crusaders and of Templars specifically.
Yeah.
You can find examples of it, lots of it in America, but also in the UK, in Spain, and in France and Hungary. You can also find this in areas where, of course, there wasn't any medieval crusade history, really. So one colleague's written about the use of crusades by Bolsonaro supporters in Brazil.
Right.
So it's really widespread. And even if there were no Templars there in the medieval period, even if there were other orders which would make more sense for a particular country to be interested in, they go for the Templars. And I think that's mostly down to how a lot of the time they will be encountering the Crusades and the Templars and other military orders originally in Anglophone media, in American and British films and games and so on. And they all go for the Templars. And that's why you can have a country like, say, Germany, where even though the most important military order there were the Teutonic Knights, they have a very long history in the country, very prominent, and they're exclusively German. Instead, they go for the Templars, who didn't have much of a history in Germany. And the same for Spain. There are all of these Spanish military orders that are really quite well known. But if you look up Vox supporters online, it'll be Templars that they use instead. And it's something that they seem to go for because the idea is slightly more appealing to them. They can sell themselves as being chivalrous knights and things, rather than saying we're skinhead thugs. But we're just like any old neo-Nazis. Instead, they can go, no, we're like these medieval knights. And everyone in UK or in America knows about knights, and so many people when they're little kids, they dress up as knights or they read stories about them and watch films about them. So don't you want to be a knight fighting against some sort of whatever menace it is that they've decided to pick on? So it's a really enduring thing, and it's every year I'm finding new material coming out, new people imitating them, and it's got to the point that there are even far-right groups that have tried to set up new military orders as well, both in the UK and in the US.
Well, Anders Breivik very much saw himself as part of this.
Yes, he claimed to be part of some new Knights Templar order, which the security services were never able to track down and concluded that he was probably making that up. But since then, there are actually real groups that go around calling themselves Templars or military orders and dressing as them. In terms of actually fighting, they don't seem to do much. There's one group, a British one, Knights Templar International. They give out non-lethal equipment to anti-refugee paramilitaries in Hungary and Romania and Bulgaria. There's an American group, the Ordo Militaris Catholicus, and they are legally a private military company registered in Montana. And they claim to be outfitting troops fighting the Russians in Ukraine, but I haven't actually found any evidence proving that yet. But that's what they say they're doing.
Wow.
And yeah, their uniform is a cross. They are supposed to live a semi-monastic life and things. They really are drawing heavily on this history in a very fascinating but also very disturbing way.
Wow, it's interesting to think you've got this massive folder on your hard drive full of these memes.
Yes, there's so many of them. But yeah, I do have quite a few of these saved because, I mean, for whenever you talk about them, you can get across the topic and how weird it is just by one of these images, because there's so much strangeness in each of them.
We need to just make sure you don't give away your identity on 4chan, because otherwise they'll be coming after you.
Yes.
Right. Okay. So finally, before we end, tell us the viewers where they can find out more on this topic and any of your current projects and what to anticipate in the future.
So I ended up publishing an article on Isaac and Stangrave's story, and that is in the journal Crusades, which is published by Routledge, and I think it's in the 2019 or 2020 volume, that one. And right now I'm still doing some more work on this far right and Crusades topic. I will have a chapter on the Ordo Catholicus Militaris coming out in Routledge's Engaging with Crusades volume on Crusades and the far right, which should be coming out hopefully this year or next year. And other than that, I'm currently doing a lot of stuff at the BL, working on this.
That's British Library.
Yes, working on this British Library project to digitize manuscripts related to medieval and Renaissance women. So I'm working through a lot of that right now, which sort of takes me over all of these different topics of, women's book ownership, women's medieval religion, women in power, and everything. So mostly my Twitter feed is just full of interesting manuscripts I come across each day.
Well, the reason I got in touch with you because you retweeted this image of the cat paw print on the and then I looked you up and I saw you did this. Then I saw your academia page and I saw this fascinating story, and I felt I really need to talk to you. I'm going to put all of that in the description and your Twitter thing as well. And this article, it was really for viewers, if you really want an example of a really good essay on how to read primary sources critically, then like, even though it's like tangential to my stuff I'm doing, it's still kind of, you can still understand it, right? And obviously you've got the story as well, which is really compelling. So with that, Dr. McClellan, Rory, thank you so much for being a guest on the Abbasid History podcast.
Thanks for having me.